All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. So today we are going to be, as discussed prior, talking about the TENET GLAXION. This is our other new Lich weapon, and it is pretty good. That being said, I do think that it will be a lot better next month whenever we get the update to all of our different damage types and armor and so on and so forth. And that is for a few different reasons. But for now, let's talk about it in its current state and what I think it'll go to later. First and foremost, if you just want to use this thing with nothing else, this is probably the build that I suggest. This is a magnetic Glaxion, which I do think is a very safe bet going into the next patch, which we'll get into more in a moment. But magnetic is adding another status for galvanized aptitude, which is a considerable damage increase. And then, of course, viral and heat are good, especially whenever you're doing Hunter Munitions things as well. So we, with Hunter Munitions, have 4 total statuses for galvanized aptitude. We are also running Merciless. This is what I would consider to be like the regular, you just want the gun to do stuff build. Unsurprisingly, I'm sure. It is a status hose, and in its Tenet form, it does now chain between enemies. So it is kind of like a new core in your primary slot, except for you don't get access to some of the things that secondaries get access to. But it's pretty good overall. Showing off just like the very basic functionality of this weapon, we are just on Invincible, usual enemies, 225, Seal Path, usual business. You can see that it's fine. Like, burns enemies down pretty well, especially like the fodder enemies it has no problem with, even like as upfront damage. And then like the heavies, it'll take like, a couple seconds. And at this level, with like, no armor stripping or no nothing really, this is solid performance for a weapon that is like, a Kuva weapon and not like an Incarnate or something like that. This is totally reasonable. Stack up a bunch of heat procs, burn through the armor, burn through, huge crowds of enemies. Whenever you're fighting like mostly like not the heavy units, obviously it's going to look much, much better. And it's totally solid. This is very reasonable. Okay performance, right? Nothing to write home about. It's doing beam weapon things. Its chain distance could maybe be slightly longer, and that would help it in just general use case scenarios. And of course, if you combine this build with like your just basic armor stripping, it looks a lot better. Really, it should be completely unsurprising. Yeah, whenever you combine it with armor stripping, which is the main thing that you're trying to surmount at all times, at least until the next big patch next month, it looks really, really good. So, if you are armor stripping and you want to use a Glaxion, good choice. That being said, if you are armor stripping and you're going to use a Glaxion, there may be some more interesting choices to make, and going forward, there may be some other stuff to do. Before we get into that, to talk about real quickly the augment that we're going to have access to kind of late in the Nightwave, Photon Overcharge. This is 90% critical damage, and then on kill or assist, slain enemies have a 2% chance to drop an energy orb per cold status affecting them. So right now, that basically gives you like an 18% chance for an enemy that is killed by the weapon to drop an energy orb, which is already pretty good. But we know that cold procs are getting an increase in their amount of stacks as of the next update. So this will probably be even better and possibly turns this into more of a utility weapon rather than a just straight up killing weapon, where you want to kill enemies with the weapon to recharge your energy more so than the weapon itself being used because it's like extremely like good on its own. So this is an interesting mod that is like kind of just completely optional. 90% critical damage is pretty good. There's definitely ways to fit that into this build. If you wanted to just like take this weapon and make it a little bit less powerful, drop Vital Sense for that, lose 30% critical damage. Not a, it's a significant loss in your damage overall, but if you're changing this weapon into a utility weapon, it's an option that you could do. And also, like maybe not going heat or doing the build that we're about to show, not going radiation. Lots of options for where that could end up in a build in the future, especially with the changes. If this weapon becomes like extremely high performance with the armor changes, just in general, then things are going to be good. The other build for this weapon, however, is Corrosive and Radiation. So you change it here, and then of course we use the Radiation Only mod, which is our Radiated Reload. The reload speed also doesn't hurt anything. And that ends up with us on Corrosive, Magnetic, Radiation, and Cold damage. And because we have cold damage by itself, because this weapon is inherently cold, we can actually use primary Frostbite and just rely on Galvanized Aptitude for our basic damage. So that gives us quite a bit of critical damage and multi-shot. So this maybe also makes it a little easier to lose that 30% on Vital Sense in favor of like the energy generation. We have, of course, the 4 statuses here, plus Hunter Munitions for 5 statuses for Galvanized Aptitude, so we get some power there. And worth noting, if you are using Corrosive Shards, of course, the Corrosive is going to be very, very effective. And in addition to that, next month, whenever we get the changes to armor and things, Corrosive without the Corrosive Shards for full stripping could become much, much more valuable just on its own. So, overall, I think that this build has a lot of potential to see a lot of use. And it's the primary reason why I did decide to go magnetic, because in the damage changes that we're going to be getting next month, also, shields of enemies are going to be getting a considerable buff, so just having a little bit of magnetic could go a long way in making it so those shields are absolutely not a problem. So with this build, we're going to show it off a couple ways, just like as the baseline of just showing it on, you know, what would happen if you just regularly use this against these guys. And then, of course, in the Corrosive Shard situation as well. Just using it regularly, it honestly doesn't perform bad. Like, I mean, you're still, of course, using Hunter Munitions to get through armor and stuff, and, like, you're getting, like, you know, significant statuses. The radiation is doing a little bit of crowd controlling, and, you know, it looks pretty good. Like, I would say that this is actually comparable to, like, what we would consider to be, like, the extremely regular build, but it performs a bit worse against fully stripped enemies, which is what you're probably normally going to be wanting to do anyway. So that's why I wouldn't consider it to be, like, the default build as of right now. Like I said, with the armor changes, that could easily change next month, and this could be, like, the build you want to always be using. But I just wanted to show that off with, you know, kind of nothing assigned to it. With that, we can, of course, swap to a Warframe that does have Corrosive Shards on, which in this case is my Revenant, and this build will look shockingly much, much better, because it will be armor stripping all of the enemies. I know that comes as a huge surprise that whenever you armor strip the enemies, that they become much weaker and easier to kill, but that's just the way that it is. Yeah, like, not the craziest performance in the world, but the armor stripping, you can clearly see, does a massive amount of work. And the cold, like, slowing the enemies. Whenever we get the, like, you know, double crit bonus and the full freeze that this weapon will have whenever cold gets its buffs next month, there's some consideration, because it would essentially be, like, you know, shooting basically Frost 4 into a crowd of enemies most times, because it does proc a ton. Freezing, you know, entire groups of enemies solid, especially if it's going to be able to freeze Eximus units solid. Just stopping a hallway and just killing them all. Like, you know, not, you know, it's not a Latum. It's not an Incarnate weapon, but it's solid. I think it'll have a place, especially with that new augment. Whenever we get access to that, you know, changing out your primary for one that's slightly worse, but that can generate an absolute ton of energy and still, like, you know, wipe out groups of fodder enemies relatively easily, I think has merit. Like, it is an absolutely acceptable weapon in its current form. Like, I would say that it is, like, you know, among the better of the Lich weapons, honestly. And especially with a little added utility, that can go a long way. It's, of course, going to have to wait until we know next month what exactly all of the changes are to armor and damage types and everything like that. But I would say that this is probably a safe bet for a weapon that is still going to be good going into that patch. But yeah, that's going to do it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you tomorrow.